The music was classical, but with a modern twist. A violin with soft piano beats in the background. The ballroom was lively and luxuriously decorated, just like every event at the Carlton Grand Hotel. But not everyone felt at ease with what was happening on stage. The violinist, a black woman with elegant braids, played with her eyes closed, as if the entire world fit into the sound coming from her instrument. The audience smiled politely, but some glances said something else. What no one knew was that night, she wouldn't just make music, she would change lives. And it all began with a small sound coming from the back corner table, the sound of fingers tapping over and over, and an involuntary noise caught in the throat. Slowly, heads began to turn. People whispered. The elegant atmosphere turned tense. In the back seat, an 11-year-old boy repeated the same movements again and again. He didn't smile. He didn't move much, but his body made sounds he couldn't control. His father looked away, pretending not to notice. His mother held his hand, trying to calm him down. And on stage, the violinist paused for a second, not out of surprise, but as if she understood something no one else did. Stay with us until the end of this powerful and unexpected story. You'll see that sometimes what bothers people the most is exactly what needs to be heard. The Carter family's arrival had not gone unnoticed. Charles Carter, one of the most influential businessmen on the East Coast, was there with his wife and son. And everyone knew who he was. His tailored suit drew attention. So did his last name, but it wasn't just that. It was the way he walked, the way he looked around, like nothing there was truly new to him, like he belonged. Elena Carter, his wife, was the opposite in almost every way. She smiled more, watched more, and seemed to notice people more than plates or speeches. Micah, their 11-year-old son, walked between them, slightly hunched. He didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, but his fingers moved, like he was counting something invisible. They sat toward the back of the room, nearly touching the wall. It was Charles's choice. More discreet this way, he said, but Elena knew what that really meant. It wasn't about being discreet, it was about hiding. Micah had been diagnosed with Tourette's syndrome 2 years earlier. Since then, Charles did everything he could to keep him out of sight, especially at events like this, where everything was about appearances, status, control. Just one night. He needs to learn how to behave. That's what he told his wife in the car before walking in. But what he didn't know was that he would be the one who had to relearn everything that night. The music on stage continued softly, but the ballroom's attention had shifted elsewhere. Micah began repeating the movements more frequently. His fingers tapped at his chin. His neck twitched gently, and the involuntary sounds slipped out, even as he tried to hold them back. It was nerves, too much light, too many people, too much noise. Micah knew that feeling. His mother did too. She leaned in slowly and whispered, "Want to step outside? We can breathe out there." He shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Maybe he wanted to stay. Maybe he just didn't want to draw more attention. Charles, beside him, kept his eyes locked on the stage, but clenched his jaw. He didn't say a word, but his silence was loud. A woman at the next table turned her head. A man farther up glanced over and frowned. No one said anything directly, but the mood was shifting. Micah's sounds didn't match the environment. They felt like a note out of tune, and Charles felt it, not because he was worried about his son, but because he was worried about the stairs. He leaned in and muttered, "If this keeps up, we're leaving. He's going too far." Elena didn't respond, but she placed her hand gently on Micah's shoulder and left it there, present, steady, silent. That's when Simone looked again, still holding her violin. She locked eyes on Micah for a moment longer, as if she had seen all of this before. Micah's sound still echoed through the room now and then. They weren't loud, but in that kind of setting, anything less than perfect was enough to disturb. A man at the next table pretended to read the menu, but kept glancing at Micah with each new tick. A woman in a blue dress whispered something into her partner's ear, without ever dropping her polite smile. Charles noticed it all. He shifted in his seat, crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, took a sip of water, then looked around, searching, maybe for support. But no one held his gaze for long, because in that ballroom full of polite applause and rehearsed solidarity, the real discomfort wasn't about the sounds, it was about the presence. Micah wasn't just a boy with tics, he was a disruption to the norm, and Simone was too. Up on stage, she still held her violin, waiting for the next piece. She was the only black performer of the night, and without saying a single word, she was already making some people uneasy. Charles let out a short sigh. He mumbled something too low for Elena to hear. She watched him from the side. She knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't just ashamed of his son. He was being confronted. The very things he claimed to support, by the truths he refused to face, and by a woman on stage he didn't even know, but who was already threatening the role he played in that space. Simone was ready to begin the second piece of the evening. It was a modern classical arrangement, written specifically for the event. She had played at bigger venues, for even more powerful audiences. But something felt different this time. At that table in the corner, Micah was still sitting between his parents, more withdrawn than before, his tics now more spaced out, maybe from exhaustion or from trying so hard to hold them in. Elena stayed beside him, steady yet gentle. Charles, on the other hand, seemed disconnected. He leaned his arms on the table but angled his body slightly away, as if trying to disappear without making a scene. Simone took her eyes off the violin and looked at Micah again. Once more, the silence between them spoke what no one else dared to say. She knew what it felt like to be watched with judgment, to try to fit into a place that was never built for you, to be excellent and still be treated like an exception. She could have followed the program and played the planned piece. It would have been the safest choice, but instead, she changed the music. With her left hand, she adjusted the bow. With her right, she played a single note, different, softer, smaller. The audience seemed confused. Then Simone began a new melody. It wasn't part of the official repertoire. It wasn't on the evening schedule. It was a slow song, gentle, with space between the notes, enough space to fit Micah's sounds. Micah slowly lifted his eyes. The new melody, flowing from the violin, was nothing like the one before. It had room between the notes. It had pauses. It had space. It was as if the music itself was breathing. And for the first time that night, he didn't feel the need to hide from the sound. There were no lyrics, no words, but something in that sequence of soft, whisper-like chords seemed to say, "You can stay. There's space for you here." He didn't speak. He didn't move, but his fingers stopped fighting the tics for the first time. He just felt Simone wasn't looking directly at him anymore, but she wasn't looking at anyone else either. The music was a silent bridge between the stage and the far end of the room, between those who listen and those who have never been heard. Elena, noticing her son relax just a bit, held her breath. It was subtle, but she knew that boy. She knew he only stopped defending himself when he realized he wasn't being attacked. Charles, on the other hand, remained disconnected. His chin rested on his hand, growing impatient, the kind of person who hears the music but doesn't listen to what it's saying. And in that moment, without even realizing it, he was losing something he could never buy, the chance to see his own son being seen. The final note of the song hung softly in the air. No one clapped. At least not right away. People looked unsure. Yes, the melody had been beautiful, but different, and in that kind of room, different wasn't always welcome. Simone stood in silence for a moment. Still holding her bow, she glanced once more at the table in the corner. Micah was staring right at her. Then she did something no one expected. She stepped forward on stage, leaned slightly toward the microphone, and spoke for the first time that night. This piece wasn't part of the program, but I felt it needed to exist. People exchanged glances. A few tight smiles appeared. Charles shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. There's someone here tonight who knows exactly what it's like to be interrupted and all the time, and even so, keeps trying to show up. That song was for him. Simone paused, then looked directly at Micah, now without hiding it. If you'd like, you can come, play with me. The room froze. Some guests turned their heads, expecting it to be a joke. Others looked toward Charles, waiting for his reaction, but he said nothing. He couldn't. Micah looked at his mother. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just smiled and gently let go of his hand. Micah slowly stood up. His father reached for his arm, trying to stop him. He didn't want to be exposed, but his mother intervened. And Micah went. Every eye in the room followed him. No one spoke, but the tension was undeniable. An 11-year-old boy with tics walking up on stage during a black-tie dinner. It wasn't in the script. It wasn't in anyone's plan. But there he was. Simone greeted him with a quiet smile, no theatrics, no drama. She knew Micah had already been through enough just by showing up. Without saying a word, she reached behind the stage and brought out a small instrument, a light, portable cajon with a warm, soft tone. She placed it in his lap and gently showed him how to play it. Simple taps with the palm and fingers. Micah looked at the instrument, then at her, and nodded. Simone lifted her violin, closed her eyes, and began a new melody. Slow, spacious, full of pauses, like before, but this time waiting for something in between. Micah listened for a few seconds, then slowly tapped the cajon once, twice. Simple. At first, his movements were a bit awkward, but soon they found the rhythm of the music, and then something happened that no one expected. The tics were still there. But now they were part of the rhythm. His hands struck with intention. His shoulders moved in time. Micah didn't look like he was holding anything back. He looked like he was playing. The entire ballroom fell silent. But it wasn't the same. Silence as before. It was the silence of people who knew they were witnessing something important, something rare, something unforgettable. The final note of Simone's violin floated in the air for a moment. Micah gave one last beat on the cajon and looked at her. She smiled, not the kind of smile that says good job, but the kind that says you did what no one else had the courage to do. You showed up. For a few seconds, no one moved. The room stayed quiet. Then a single clap, then another. And only then, more. But it wasn't cheerful applause. It was hesitant. Almost ashamed, as if everyone had just been reminded of something important, and a little uncomfortable. Charles Carter didn't clap. He kept staring at the glass on the table, as if none of it had anything to do with him. But Elena stood up, clapped with conviction, and walked to the front of the stage to meet her son. Out of respect, Simone walked with Micah only to the edge of the stage. There, she bent down, whispered something, just for him, something no one else could hear, and let him go with his mother. As they walked back to their table, the murmurs began. It wasn't scandal, it was something deeper, more subtle. People whispered to one another. Others simply looked at Simone with quiet respect. An older woman sitting near the bar murmured, "I never thought I'd get emotional at a dinner like this." A young businessman said to his wife, "I think we've been applauding the wrong people for a long time." And a black woman, who had stayed silent until then, smiled with tears in her eyes. That night, No one left the Carlton Grand saying the dinner had been perfect. But many walked out different than they came, less elegant, more human. The next day, a video began circulating online. Someone in the audience had recorded the entire moment, the boy with tics, playing the cajon with strength and sensitivity, and the black woman beside him on violin, creating harmony off-script. The caption read, "The most genuine moment in a night full of masks." In less than 24 hours, the video hit 100,000 views, then 500,000, and soon over 1 million. The reactions were immediate. Commentary channels picked it up. Smaller news outlets shared it. Famous people reposted saying, "Who is this violinist? What a beautiful thing she did. And that boy, such musicality, such presence. More than empathy, the public saw talent. The way Micah kept the rhythm, the softness of his beats, the way he timed his sounds with the flow of the music. It was like he'd been doing it his whole life." A professional musician commented, "The rhythmic control this kid has is unreal. With the right guidance, he could go far." But not all feedback was applause. Some started asking why no one reacted enthusiastically in the moment. Others criticized the audience's behavior. And soon, Charles Carter's name came into focus. News outlets reminded people that he often spoke about inclusion, equality, and empathy. But in the video, he sat frozen, cold arms crossed, and once they discovered the boy was his son, the criticism got harsher. Why didn't he stand up? How can someone see their own child shine and not react? Isn't this the same guy who talks about diversity at corporate conferences? At first, Charles tried to ignore it, but the comments wouldn't stop. Meetings began getting cancelled, and the discomfort started to seep into his own company. It was as if the whole world had finally seen what he had spent years trying to hide. And the worst part wasn't being exposed. It was realizing that the only one who hadn't seen Micah was his own father. Charles arrived at the music school tense, jaw clenched. He had spent days watching his name flood social media posts, articles, and videos, being called out for a silence he could no longer justify. He came there angry at the exposure, at the discomfort, and at the woman who, with one simple act, disrupted the image he had spent years building. But when he walked into the music room, he froze. He hadn't expected to find Micah there. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Micah, sitting in the center of a circle, playing the cajon with control and grace, smiling, high-fiving another boy, looking at the teacher with confidence. Like he'd known that place for years. This was the same son who, just days earlier, could barely sit still at the dinner. Now, he looked light, present, free. Simone noticed him standing at the door and walked over calmly. "You came to pick up Micah?" "No, I came to understand what kind of mess you've caused in my life." "The mess, Mr. Carter, started long before I came along. Did you have the right to put my son on display like that?" "He wasn't put on display. He was seen," Charles scowled. "And why did you bring my son here?" "I didn't. Your wife came to me. She said he needed a place where he didn't have to shrink to exist, and I offered that place with music." Charles looked away for a second, then pointed toward Micah, still smiling with his classmates. "And you think this is enough?" Simone crossed her arms, but her voice came out calm and steady. "I grew up in a neighborhood where the loudest sound was sirens. My first school had music classes, but only 3 instruments and none of them whole. I was rejected from 2 academies for not fitting the profile. There was an event where they asked me to leave the stage and not perform, and once they told me to straighten my hair." She paused, then looked discreetly at Micah, now laughing with the others. "Music saved my life, Mr. Carter, but it only became real freedom when I stopped trying to fit in and started playing to make room." She pointed at Micah and continued, "Your son has rhythm, but more than that, he has truth. He doesn't need protection. He needs space, recognition, someone who sees all of him. No shame. No filters. Charles didn't respond, but for the first time, he didn't try to defend his image. He just listened. Charles left the music school dazed, silent, the same silence he had always demanded from his son. But now it felt full of questions. He drove with no destination, past streets he'd never noticed, instrument shops, kids playing on sidewalks, a man playing sax on the corner, and for a moment, everything seemed to speak to him, without a word. At dinner that night, he didn't correct Micah's posture, didn't mention the volume of his voice. He just watched, feeling a discomfort that wasn't with his son, it was with himself. In the days that followed, he tried to act like nothing had changed, woke up early, went to work, kept his meetings, but inside, something was unraveling. The image of Micah, playing joyfully with the other kids, the sound of his laughter woven into each beat, Simone's watchful eyes, guiding without controlling. It kept coming back, always came back. Charles was quiet on the outside, but loud on the inside. He felt like a butterfly still inside the cocoon, wings trembling, building strength to fly. He started noticing things he'd always ignored, how Elena always held Micah's hand under the table during tense moments, how his son mimicked the sound of silverware with his fingers when he thought no one was watching, how Simone said that freedom was about stopping the effort to fit in and starting to create space. One morning, he arrived at work early and spent 30 minutes in his car, the engine running. But he stayed still, just thinking. That afternoon, he asked his assistant to delay a meeting and left, without saying where he was going. He needed to buy something. Micah was in the living room, cleaning his cajon with his mom. He had a small performance. The next day, not a concert, not a gala dinner, just a little music gathering with other kids from the school. But to him, it was enough. Elena was checking the times when Charles appeared at the door. No tie, no rush, and holding a box in his hands. "This is for you," he said, offering the gift. Micah opened it slowly. Inside was a brand new cajon, custom-made. On the side, his name was engraved in soft lettering, and just beneath it a small phrase, "You have rhythm and you have truth." Micah didn't say a word, but he smiled, a soft, sincere smile, full of space between the notes. Elena let a tear fall, but this time it wasn't sadness. Charles sat down on the floor beside Micah. For the first time, he gave no instructions, didn't ask for quiet, he just sat there, present, whole. Outside, the world was still the same, but in that room, sound was no longer a problem. It was music. The video from the gala kept circulating online for weeks, but with time, a new image began to spread. It was from a public auditorium, during an event on inclusion and the fight against prejudice and racism. On stage, standing side by side, were none other than Simone Akers and Charles Carter, the same man who, months earlier, couldn't bring himself to clap for his own son. That night, months later, in the auditorium of the Cultural Project, Charles wasn't there as a sponsor or as a businessman. He was there as a student of life, as someone who had learned, late but in time, how to listen. During his speech, the audience heard something they never expected from a man like Charles. "The truth is, for a long time, I was the kind of person who supported equality, only when it didn't make me uncomfortable. I grew up surrounded by the codes of success, with clear rules. Successful men don't cry, perfect children don't fidget at the table, and good music doesn't come from just anyone. I believed control meant strength." He paused. "That night, I watched my son break all those rules and get a standing ovation for it." A journalist in the audience jumped in. "And Simone?" Charles nodded slowly. "She wasn't welcome on that stage, and still, She didn't ask for permission, she just played, and in doing so forced us to listen to what we had been ignoring. He looked toward his son in the crowd. I was the father who felt ashamed of his own son for not fitting the mold. I was the man who tried to silence Simone's talent before I even knew her, and I'm not proud of any of it. Then, turning to Simone, he continued, "Even when I saw my son shine on stage beside a woman the system always overlooked, I still couldn't recognize what real strength was. All I knew was power. It took stepping out of my comfort zone to realize how small I really was, not because I failed, but because I never tried to understand." Charles then announced a joint initiative with Simone, a permanent fund to support music schools in underserved communities and cultural projects led by Black women and children with disabilities. He passed the mic to Simone, who closed with power and grace. Art alone doesn't change the world, but it reveals who's ready to change it alongside it. Everyone is welcome in this movement to acknowledge the pain caused by prejudice, because it's not always a scream. Sometimes it hides in silence, in the glance that turns away, in the applause that never comes. And this time Charles clapped, standing with both hands. By the end of the event, no one left the same. But Micah didn't change. He was simply given permission to be whole. Simone didn't ask for a seat. She broke the silence with sound, and Charles didn't become a role model, but he had the courage to do what most avoid. Look inward. If you've ever felt invisible in a crowded room, if someone ever made you believe you were the problem, this story is here to remind you. The problem was never your sound, it was their ears. And if you've never experienced that, but felt uncomfortable watching this, don't look away, don't excuse it, transform it. You can be the next person to make space or the next one to deny it. The choice is yours. Tell us in the comments, what did this story make you feel? And what space do you still need to open, in yourself or around you? Subscribe for more stories that challenge, embrace, and awaken. Share this with someone who needs to hear what the world keeps trying to silence. Because the world doesn't change when the majority applauds, but when the minority keeps playing, even without an audience.